and welcome to their new season of EconVersations. My name is Dan Sutter. I'm the Charles Koch Professor of Economics here at the Johnson Center at Troy University, and I'll be the new host of the show for this season. For those of you who miss Dr. Bullier, Scott Bullier will definitely be back to make an appearance on the show during this season, and also probably to guest host a time or two. We're very excited about the new season of EconVersations. We've hired several new faculty members of the Johnson Center, and we'll have an opportunity to talk with them about their research. Joining us tonight is John Dove, an assistant professor here at the Johnson Center. And John got his completed his dissertation from West Virginia University, and he's joined Troy University this fall from Mercer University over in Georgia. So John, welcome.
Thank you.
John has done research on the effects of government default and the implications of that back in the 1800s. And we want to begin our conversation tonight because Detroit last month recently became the largest city in American history to declare bankruptcy. Now, how did Detroit get into the mess that it's currently in?
Yeah, well, Detroit is definitely a very interesting situation. In fact, I have a graphic here, if we can go to that shows a number of headlines, just to show sort of the magnitude associated with Detroit, obviously making national news. And really, Detroit's situation defaulted on almost $20 billion worth of debt. But ultimately, the issue that Detroit has faced is something that's really sort of developed, over a number of years, really largely associated with increases in spending, government spending, and public expenditures, especially increases in spending during a time when there have been large reductions in population, and which has really resulted in a situation where the spending's ultimately become unsustainable. Pension obligations also within the city of Detroit have risen to such a proportion that the city government really is unable to actually meet those obligations. As a result of all of this, we really see Detroit in the position that it now finds itself in.
So what happens typically with these bankruptcies when cities go bankrupt? Because the sun has continued to rise in Detroit. Sure. The Tigers recently went on a 12-game winning streak, which made me very happy as a Detroit native. So between the examples of cities and states that went bankrupt in the 1800s, and what can we see is in store for the people in Detroit as events unfold with this bankruptcy?
Sure, yeah, there are a number of issues associated with a bankruptcy. Ultimately, a bankruptcy like that, the result really is it's something similar to what you and I could expect if we were to also file for bankruptcy. Ultimately, when you and I end up in a situation where we can't pay the bills or we can't repay the debts that we've incurred, then we also go and file for bankruptcy. Usually the end result of that is a situation where it will be a number of years before you're able to borrow again. If you are able to borrow again, you generally have to pay a much higher interest rate because you're a much more risky individual than somebody that's credit worthy. So the interest rate begins to rise, and we see the exact same thing happen when, with the city of Detroit, or when state and other local governments do the same thing. They see their borrowing costs rise. They see that it may be quite a while before they can actually borrow again.
Well, as you mentioned, Detroit wasn't the first city to go bankrupt, and in fact, in the 1800s, we had several waves of both states and then cities. That's right. Going bankrupt.
That's right. Yeah, in fact, the second graphic that we have actually shows some of the effects on just normal everyday citizens. The first wave of actual large-scale default that we had in the U.S. Occurred in the late 1830s and early 1840s. Again, this was actually this was a number of states. It was actually 9 states that defaulted on their debts. 5 of those states actually repudiated all or part of those debts, where repudiation is effectively a government says that we don't recognize this this debt that we've incurred, and so we're going to erase it, and good luck trying to collect on it if you lent to us.
Did anybody ever collect that debt, or was it really actually totally erased?
It was completely erased. In fact, well, the state of Mississippi completely erased its debt. Arkansas erased a large portion of its debt. Interestingly enough, Michigan erased a large portion of its debt. So yeah, we do definitely see that was the situation.
I think we have a graphic here, a picture from the Panic of 1837.
That's right.
Which is when the states started actually going into bankruptcy or approaching bankruptcy.
That's right.
But that certainly wasn't what got them into trouble. They were in trouble before the panic occurred. So how did states get themselves into trouble back in the 1800s?
Well, in a lot of ways, it really was a similar situation to what you see with Detroit. You see a lot of increases in public expenditures and government spending. What states were really trying to do in the 1800s or the 1830s, in a lot of ways what we see today as well, is really trying to invest in infrastructure, also actually directly investing into private companies, so using public monies to provide a number of loans and loan guarantees to private companies and corporations. Ultimately, the idea was that, you know, if we invest in this, then our economies will be able to grow and we'll be able to flourish. This was really a result of the Erie Canal, which was the first time in U.S. history where we see large-scale government involvement in a private undertaking. The Erie Canal was extremely successful for the state of New York, and the state of New York actually earned a lot of profit off of that investment. States looked at that and thought that they could do the same thing.
Well, it sounds sort of similar to cities recently all trying to imitate San Antonio, and however many cities have built river walks to
That's
try
right.
to emulate the San Antonio, or invested in sports stadiums.
That's right.
Now, what was the role of investors in all of this? Because as states were taking on too much debt, you would have anticipated that investors should have made states start to pay more money, more interest to borrow.
Definitely, yeah, that's something, and again, we have some visuals to show that as well. We'll talk about those in a second, but yeah, exactly. What we see really early on, eastern states, so states like more established states like Pennsylvania, New York, some of those East Coast states, they could command an interest rate of just 3 to 4%. So they could borrow money for 3 to 4%. However, as the crisis approaches, and then the Panic of 1837 approaches, and as the Depression ensues and states begin to default and repudiate those debts, we see interest rates rise dramatically. Here we see this is Maryland actually, and Maryland was actually one of those states that defaulted. And so, as you can see here, what I'm showing here on the y-axis is the actual, ultimately, the interest rate that the state had to pay in order to borrow funds, and it really peaked at almost 15 to 16%. If you go to the next slide, we can look at another state. Here is actually, this is Illinois. Illinois was also a state that defaulted, and as you can see, when they were in the middle of all that, the interest rate that they actually had to pay in order to borrow peaked at nearly 40%, maybe 38% or so. And again, to just kind of equate it, that would effectively be a similar situation where you and I went to a bank in order to try to borrow to try to borrow funds, and the bank would let us, but at a 38% annual interest rate.
Right. And so, I guess that was probably more a sign that they were in trouble, not the cause of their trouble, the high interest rates here.
Exactly. That's exactly the signal it sent, was this is how risky those states actually were. Yes. Okay.
Now, then after the states started to go bankrupt, they made some important institutional changes afterwards. They actually they took some steps to try to prevent this from happening again by enacting various forms of balanced budget amendments. So, could you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Sure, definitely. And that's really where my research tries to go, is thinking about and looking at what actually happened after all of these defaults. Because the interesting question for me is, I looked at that situation and saw that a number of those states were actually able to borrow again relatively quickly after defaulting or even repudiating. And they were actually able to do it on relatively favorable terms. The interest rates weren't catastrophic, I guess you could say. And so the question that I asked was, why did that happen? And like you're suggesting, what I tried to look at were a number of laws that states actually imposed on themselves in order to prevent that behavior from happening in the future. These included restrictions or strong prohibitions on allowing states to invest public money into private undertakings and private businesses. Again, that was largely due to the amount of cronyism that we really saw with a lot of those funds. You saw a lot of cronyism and lobbying by these private businesses trying to get these public funds, right. Which may not have necessarily been the best investment, but that's definitely the incentive created. And then also we see a number of states also pass borrowing restrictions, which either completely prohibited or greatly reduced the amount of money that a state government could actually borrow in the future.
Mm-hmm. So did Illinois adopted one of these budget constraints? And so the lower interest rates that they were paying after their bankruptcy here is illustrating sort of the effect of this, right?
Yeah, that's what I look at, and that's what I try to sort of tease out, and that's ultimately what I find is that, a large impact on why it was that, states like Illinois or Maryland or any other state that did default, why they did actually see some of those relatively lower interest rates was a result of those restrictions that they imposed.
Now, your work touches on an important issue, and that is the idea that we might need to constrain government somehow, that the states were passing both legislative and then also constitutional restrictions on their ability to borrow. Now, if you are a strong believer in democracy, you think that perhaps politicians should be restrained in their borrowing just by normal political forces. But on the other hand, a number of people believe that the United States needs to adopt a balanced budget amendment that would be located in the Constitution. I mean, what's sort of some of the arguments as to why we actually need these constitutional level restrictions on the powers of government?
Sure, yeah, well, it really just comes down to basic economic principles and economic insights, and just understanding incentives and understanding the fact that incentives really matter, like you and I teach our principal students, really. And so to think about it, it's ultimately, we know that politicians will react to the incentives that they face, just like you and I will. Well, one really strong incentive that politicians do have is to try to get elected and to try to get reelected. One very good way to do that is to accrue a whole lot of benefits onto their constituents, right? So, you can think about it sort of bringing home the bacon, I guess, or bringing home the pork. So politicians have a strong incentive to try to spend money or bring home these benefits to their constituents, and then also simultaneously to try to have other people pay for it now or pay for it later. Again, you see an issue like we're looking at here where there's a large amount of debt that's accrued. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're borrowing a lot, well, you can bring all kinds of benefits home today and then have all of that debt paid for later by somebody else. Now, unfortunately, the problem associated with that is that someday that debt really does have to be paid. Now, if you've been pursuing that policy long enough, it may be, as we've seen with a number of states in the 1830s and 1840s, you may have a situation where it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to actually repay that debt. And that's why something like a balanced budget amendment would be extremely important, to actually prevent and stop behavior like that from happening going forward.
So this problem of borrowing excessively is actually something that ends up being encouraged at the ballot box. Politicians can actually win a re-election by spending money that they don't have yet, or issuing IOUs for the future.
That's right. It's always easier to spend other people's money.
And to run up credit card bills, as
That's right.
people often do. Now, the states weren't the only governments to get into trouble in the 1800s. We actually saw then, about 30 years later, a repeat of this, but now at the municipal level.
Exactly.
So you could tell us a little bit about what happened here with municipalities and when this happened.
Sure. Yeah, that's what we see next, and actually here what we see, just to kind of give a visual to the audience, really thinking about kind of the magnitude of both state debt and local debt, and how much it actually increased over time. Local debt by far through the 1800s was much higher than any other debt, and really the problems that we see emerged through the 1870s and 1880s when there's a much larger increase in debt as well. But ultimately, what happened was, as a result of these constitutional restrictions that the states imposed on themselves, well, it really left a void that municipalities were willing to fill, because many of these restrictions didn't actually prohibit municipal governments from pursuing effectively the same behavior.
Right.
So as a result of that, municipalities actually began investing public funds in private companies and private corporations, and also in infrastructure projects. Really beginning in the 1850s with large-scale investment in railroads, again with the same arguments that it would help to increase economic activity, help to bring businesses into a location, help a location to better compete. And so that's really where that develops from, is in the 1850s, and then really sort of coming to a head in the 1870s.
So we see then, we can see in the local debt column there's largely in the 1860s and 1870s that a lot of that debt was taken on.
Exactly.
And then that set the crisis, or it set the stage for a crisis in 1873.
So, just like we had the Panic of 1837 and the ensuing Depression from that, in 1873 there was also another financial panic that swept through the U.S. This graphic right here kind of shows some of the on-the-ground effects of that financial panic. This right here, I think, is a bank run from 1873. But it was really a result of that again, many of the investments that these municipalities had been investing in or guaranteeing and supporting, they failed through the panic, just as they had failed in 1837. And because of that, municipal governments were largely unable to cover those debt obligations. And again, this is actually a scene during the Panic of 1873. This is a scene from Wall Street, right out front of the New York Stock Exchange on the day of the panic.
And so what ended up happening with the municipalities? How many cities ended up going bankrupt, or how big of an impact was this?
Right, yeah, it's interesting that we talk about the magnitude of Detroit and how much of a big deal Detroit is right now. But that's, at the end, it really is just one local government. There have been several others recently that have found themselves in trouble. Obviously, Jefferson County, they filed for bankruptcy. But during the Panic of 1873, there were hundreds and possibly thousands of municipalities that had defaulted on their obligations as well, and many of them also repudiating. The total magnitude was out of all the outstanding municipal debt at the time, almost 20% had actually been defaulted on as a result of this panic.
Now, and again, states or the political sector turned to some restrictions on borrowing for cities. And so how did that end up helping to address the problem?
Yeah, again, it's funny how history repeats itself. It really was almost a mirror image of what we saw through the 1830s and 1840s with state governments. Many states imposed the almost exact same restrictions on municipal governments as they had on state governments in the 1830s and 40s. Really curtailing the ability of municipal governments to invest in those private companies and infrastructure projects and railroads. Again, with the belief being that to curtail all of this excessive borrowing and excessive spending that had gone on through the 1850s, 60s, and 70s.
Well, specifically in your research, you were able to turn to, I think, what seems to be a new data source that people hadn't used before to be able to address some of these issues. And I think you can tell us about this this source that you were able to turn to actually investigate the effect of these restrictions on municipal borrowing or their ability to borrow again.
That's right. This is a front page from the Commercial and Financial Chronicle, which was actually through the latter half of the 1800s was a direct competitor of the Wall Street Journal. Never had quite the circulation that the Wall Street Journal did, but was nevertheless fairly important. This is actually a headline from the panic as it happened, wondering if when and if the stock exchange would actually rebound and the stock market would rebound. But this source was actually a weekly publication that provided national news as far as economic events were concerned, and provided a large data source on the actual prices that many of these municipal and state bonds actually traded at, just as you see with something like the Wall Street Journal today.
And not all of the restrictions on borrowing were the same that the states adopted. Different states adopted different restrictions, and so that was important in your research as well, right?
That's right. That's right. I definitely tried to differentiate as best I could to really look at how strict were some of these restrictions, because again, some states completely prohibited those governments from ever borrowing money again. And obviously that's changed over time, but at the time that's what it was. Whereas other states maybe allowed those governments to borrow up to a certain limit, or even allowed borrowing to an unlimited amount just based on some sort of vote by the state legislature, or maybe even people within the state, citizens within a state. And so that's really what I tried to look at, were those differences between the states and what impact they have.
And as a rule, what did you find?
Ultimately, what really seemed to turn out to be the most important was that those stricter safeguards and those stricter prohibitions were the ones that actually led to much lower borrowing costs, or the lowest borrowing costs relative to others.
And again, the lower borrowing costs are showing that these restrictions are more effective. How so?
Well, the lower borrowing costs and the lower interest, or ultimately the lower interest rate, is showing that they're more effective in that it's now cheaper for a government to borrow, which means that government will have to raise fewer taxes in order to pay off that debt in the future if it does exist. It also really sort of forces governments to more carefully target where it is that they're going to invest those resources if they have the opportunity to do so.
No, at least the state balanced budget amendments still, or state budget rules are still largely in effect today, right?
That's right. That's right.
So are they still restricting state borrowing, or?
Yeah, well, actually today, the 49 states do actually have some form of a balanced budget amendment. Of course, the ones that we see today, they're somewhat different than what we had then, and there are different levels or different stringencies associated with those balanced budgets today, or amendments today. Some of them, for instance, only require that a government or a governor submit a balanced budget to the state legislature, while others require the government to sign a balanced budget, or the legislature to pass a balanced budget. So we have all these different variations. But to my knowledge, what most research does show, even with those balanced budget amendments today, is that again, the stricter the amendment is, generally the lower the interest rate is that states have to pay in order to borrow money.
Mm-hmm. So just to wrap up here, what would be the implications of your research for the federal government's future, since we're so far in debt? Mm-hmm. Would a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, in your opinion, be a good idea or not?
Yeah, I definitely think that there are some very good outcomes that would emerge from something like that. Ultimately, as we've been talking about, it would really force the federal government, or any government for that matter, to be much more careful about where it is they actually invest public funds to begin with, if they're going to do it. And it would, as we talked about, really bind politicians' hands from trying to accrue benefits today and then forcing those costs onto people tomorrow. So yeah, in that sense, I definitely think that there would be some merit with that.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much. I think this is an interesting and enlightening discussion. As we've seen, Detroit wasn't the first city to go bankrupt, and it's probably unlikely to be the last city to go bankrupt. And certainly, public sector debt is a problem that persists with us, for us here in the United States today. So, John, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank you for joining us. We'll have a new episode next week, so please tune in next week for our next episode of EconVersations. Thank you very much.